I taught my son not to lie. I taught him to take responsibility. I thought I was ready to do anything to protect my child. But when he came home in tears, covered in blood, and said, "Mom, I didn't know what to do," I stopped being a teacher. I became an accomplice. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Karen Whitmore. I was 43 years old when the world I'd built so carefully began to crack. Back then, I lived in a small town in Pennsylvania, one of those places with old brick post offices and white painted fences, where the coffee shop still knew your order and your Sunday name. I was a high school English teacher. Nothing fancy, nothing anyone would write a book about. I had my routines. I had my son. I had what people would call a good life. I woke every morning at 6:15, not because I had to, but because I liked the silence before the day started. It was the only time the house belonged to me alone. I would brew a single cup of coffee, black, always, and sit on the edge of the kitchen stool, staring out the window toward the neighbor's oak tree that never quite lost all its leaves. I'd listen to the hum of the refrigerator and think about nothing in particular. That 15-minute pocket of stillness was sacred, like a breath the world allowed me before it began shouting again. By 6:45, I was packing lunch, turkey sandwiches or leftovers from dinner, a granola bar, an apple, maybe a note tucked into my son's bag if I remembered. His name was Evan, 15 years old, with a mop of dark curls he refused to cut and a laugh that used to come easily. Some mornings he was already awake, scrolling his phone or mumbling over cereal. Other times I had to knock twice, threaten to pour water on his head. He was a good kid. At least I believed that then. Our home was a modest, two-story structure with peeling paint on the porch and uneven floorboards in the upstairs hallway. But it was ours, paid off slowly, painfully, over years of teaching, tutoring on the side, and saying no to vacations. It smelled like lemon cleaner and dryer sheets, and sometimes, on bad days, burnt toast. The living room held more books than furniture. The walls were lined with framed photos of Evan's younger years, toothless grins, scraped knees, Halloween costumes that took me weeks to sew by hand. There were no recent pictures. I don't know why I stopped taking them. Maybe he stopped letting me. At school, I was Ms. Whitmore, room 212. I taught 10th and 12th grade English, depending on the semester. I knew how to command silence with just a look, how to interpret slouched shoulders and tapped pencils, how to pull essays out of students who didn't believe they had anything to say. My bulletin board was always neat. I kept a drawer full of granola bars for kids who hadn't eaten. I wrote dozens of college recommendations each year, always careful to add a line that made each one feel unique. Parents trusted me. The principal trusted me. I was the kind of teacher who stayed late, who chaperoned dances, who paid for prom tickets when a student couldn't afford it. I wasn't extraordinary. I didn't win awards or make headlines. But I mattered in my small corner of the world, and that was enough. Outside of school, my life was quiet. I didn't date, not since Evan's father left when he was 6. We'd been married for 8 years, but somewhere between the lost jobs and the empty apologies, love turned into resignation. He left with 2 suitcases and a silence that lasted to this day. I didn't have time to feel abandoned. I had a child to raise, a life to build. Evenings were slow. I'd grade papers at the kitchen table while Evan watched TV in the next room or played games online with friends whose names I never remembered. Sometimes we had dinner together. Sometimes we didn't. He was becoming his own person, and I was learning to step back. not because I wanted to, but because it was what good mothers did. We didn't fight often. When we did, it was about little things: dishes left in the sink, assignments turned in late, a grade that didn't match his potential. I tried to choose my battles. I told myself he was just a teenager, that all boys pulled away from their mothers eventually. I still believed that I knew him, that underneath the layers of growing pain and adolescent defiance, the same boy who once clung to my leg on the first day of kindergarten was still there. I held on to that belief like a raft in a rising tide. Weekends were predictable: laundry, grocery shopping, lesson planning, maybe a movie if I wasn't too tired. I read novels late into the night when insomnia crept in. I kept my television on low volume, as if loud noise might shatter the fragile calm I'd constructed. I rarely saw friends. I had acquaintances, other teachers, parents from PTA meetings, but no one who really knew me. No one who would notice if something inside me began to fray. My life had edges, but they were smooth, controlled, manageable. I'd spent years sanding them down, taming every unpredictable element. I thought that if I kept everything in its place, if I followed the rules, life would reward me with peace. I thought I had earned that peace, but peace is a glass house. It looks solid until something shatters it, and it would shatter, soon. But in those last days of normalcy, I walked through life with the quiet pride of someone who had done everything right. I had raised a child, alone. I had held a job, paid my bills, taught generations of teenagers to find their voice in literature. I had endured abandonment, loneliness, exhaustion, and never once let it show. I was the woman with the answers, the stable one, the good one, and I had no idea how quickly that identity could be stripped away. It happened on a Tuesday evening, the kind that smelled of wet asphalt and fading daylight. I had stayed late at school grading essays on redemption in the Scarlet Letter, the irony of which would later feel almost cruel. The hallways had been quiet, the lockers like closed mouths keeping their secrets. When I finally turned off the classroom lights, the sky outside was already bruising into twilight. I remember thinking how peaceful the parking lot looked, empty, still, unaware. When I got home, the house felt wrong. The porch light was off, though I always left it on for him. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the air carried a faint metallic scent, something sharp and unfamiliar, like pennies and rain. There were muddy footprints across the kitchen tile, one of his sneakers lying abandoned near the counter. My heart began its slow, deliberate panic, that peculiar rhythm that comes when fear hasn't yet found its name. I found him in the garage. The car door was open, the engine ticking softly, still warm. He was sitting on the floor, his hands trembling, his face pale under the fluorescent light. There was a small streak of blood on the hood, thin as a brush stroke. For a moment, I didn't understand what I was seeing. My mind tried to fold it into something ordinary, something explainable. But then I saw the dent on the bumper and the smear of red across the license plate. Time thickened, became something heavy and slow. I could hear the sound of my own breath, short and shallow. He was shaking, whispering words I couldn't yet process. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to know. I only knew that something irreversible had already happened, and that whatever choice I made next would define both our lives. He had been driving. He wasn't supposed to, not without me. It was late, raining, dark. A woman had crossed the road, he said, too suddenly. There had been a sound, a thud, a scream, or maybe just the echo of impact. He had stopped for a moment, frozen, waiting for her to move. She hadn't. Then fear took over. He had driven home, fast, shaking, his heart sprinting ahead of him. I remember standing there, feeling the pulse of my own life splitting into two directions. In one, I would pick up the phone and call the police, tell them everything. Trust the system, trust justice, trust that the truth, even in its brutality, was the only way forward. In the other, I would do what every instinct in my body screamed for: protect my child, erase his mistake, shield him from the kind of world that would devour him whole. It wasn't a rational decision. It wasn't even a conscious one. It was something primal, ancient, older than morality itself. A mother's reflex, sharper than logic, deadlier than fear. I told myself it was temporary, just until we understood what had happened, until we knew if she was alive. I told myself I wasn't breaking the law. I was buying time. But even then, deep down, I knew that was a lie. The first thing I did was wash his hands. The water turned pink, then clear. I took his clothes and threw them into the washer with too much detergent, scrubbing the stains from the cuffs as if effort alone could erase guilt. I went outside, my breath white in the cold, and stood before the car. The dent looked obscene, like a wound that refused to close. I touched it. My fingers came away sticky. I wiped the hood clean, then the grill, then the headlights. I used half a bottle of cleaner until my hands burned and the metal gleamed. The smell of chemicals filled the air, mixing with the faint sweetness of iron. I worked mechanically, like someone carrying out orders. When I was done, I drove the car out to the old service road behind the industrial park, a forgotten stretch of gravel where no one went after dark. I parked it behind a line of rusting containers and covered it with a torn tarp I found nearby. The drive back felt endless. My reflection in the windshield looked like someone I didn't recognize, my face pale, my eyes too calm. I remember thinking that I had crossed something invisible, something sacred. I had spent my entire life believing in right and wrong, in consequence, in the clean separation between truth and deceit. And now, I was standing on the wrong side of it, watching the distance between who I was and who I'd become widen with every mile. At home, I scrubbed the sink, wiped the counters, picked up his sneakers. I told myself that order would save me, that if I made the house look normal, maybe it would become normal again. But the silence was heavy, unnatural. Every sound, the refrigerator hum, the ticking of the clock, felt amplified, accusatory. I barely slept that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between the passing cars outside. Each headlight that swept through the blinds felt like judgment, like exposure. My mind replayed every possible outcome. The police knocking on the door, the look on his face when they took him away, the headlines, the whispers at school. I saw his future unraveling before my eyes, a life reduced to a single moment of fear. At dawn, I walked into his room. He was asleep, his face softened into something childlike again. I watched him breathe, and I felt that unbearable swell of love that mothers carry, the one that destroys reason. I thought of the nights he had fevered as a baby, when I'd sat beside him counting breaths. I thought of the first time he fell off his bike and cried not from pain, but from shame. I thought of all the times I had promised him that I would never let anything hurt him. And so I made another promise, one that would cost me everything. I spent the next day crafting our story. He had been home that evening, watching television. I had been at school late, grading papers, just as I always did. The car had been parked in the garage the entire time. I rehearsed the details until they felt true. Lies, I learned, needed rhythm. They had to sound lived in. I deleted his recent text messages, wiped his call history, checked the news obsessively. There was a small note about a hit and run on Route 43. The victim was alive but in critical condition. No witnesses, it said. I felt both relief and dread. Relief that she lived. Dread because it meant the story wasn't over. By the third day, I had convinced myself we were safe, that what I had done was an act of love, not deceit. I held my head high at school, smiled through classes, assigned essays on moral choices, as though I still believed I understood what those words meant. But inside, I was dissolving. Every glance from a colleague felt like suspicion. Every siren in the distance twisted my stomach into knots. At night, I caught myself listening for footsteps outside. Each creak of the floorboards made me flinch. I started locking the doors twice, sometimes 3 times. I checked the windows before bed, even the ones on the second floor. I told myself I was protecting him, but in truth, I was protecting my illusion of control. I had spent my life teaching others that honesty was strength, that facing one's mistakes was the only path to redemption. Yet here I was, constructing a fortress of lies around my own child, convincing myself it was mercy. Days turned into weeks. The police canvassed the neighborhood, asking questions, showing photos. I kept my composure, nodding sympathetically, offering coffee, pretending to care. They left polite cards with phone numbers on them. I threw them away. But guilt is not something you can bury under concrete. It seeps through cracks, stains everything it touches. I saw it in the way he avoided my eyes, in the way his laughter died mid-sound. We became two ghosts haunting the same house, bound by a secret that hummed like electricity in the walls. There were moments when I almost confessed. When I stood by the phone, my hand hovering over the receiver, imagining the sound of a dispatcher's voice. But I never did. Each time, love pulled me back like a leash. Each time, I chose silence. And that was how I crossed the line, not in a single act, but in 1,000 small choices that blurred together until I couldn't tell where one ended and another began. I told myself I was saving him. I told myself I was strong. But strength built on fear is just another kind of weakness. In the end, it wasn't the accident that changed us. It was the cover-up, the lie that grew roots in our home, winding through every corner, choking everything pure. And once I stepped across that invisible line, there was no going back. The first thing that struck me was the sound, a hollow metallic echo that clanged and vibrated through my ribs like a second heartbeat. Every movement, footsteps, keys turning, doors shutting, produced noise that felt both distant and immediate, as though the building itself were alive, breathing impulses of surveillance and restraint. There were no soft surfaces, no colors, no warmth, just concrete, steel, fluorescent light, and the hum of something too large and too cold to be understood in one glance. I had imagined jail before, in theory, in lesson plans, in novels, a place where wrongdoers were separated from the world to reflect, to be punished, to change. But that version belonged to fiction. What I stepped into was not a place of correction. It was a different planet. It smelled of bleach, metal, sweat, and something sickly sweet that reminded me of old bananas. The air was dry but clung to your skin, as if even it refused to let you go. They processed me quickly, efficient, almost casual, like it happened all the time. Because it did. The woman at intake didn't look me in the eye when she asked me to strip. Her voice was flat, practiced. I was asked to lift my arms, to squat, to cough. There was no space for dignity, no room for hesitation. I felt myself float somewhere above my body as I obeyed, as if this were happening to someone else, someone I used to be, someone I wouldn't be again. They handed me clothing, a beige jumpsuit, undergarments in a plastic wrap, socks that felt damp before I even put them on. The shoes were rubber, thick and soulless. My own clothes, the ones I had carefully chosen that morning, folded and bagged in front of me like evidence of a former life. I watched as they sealed the bag with a label bearing my name, as though I had become inventory. Then came the bracelet, plastic, white, with numbers. I was not Karen anymore. I was 37264. My name still existed, but only on paperwork and whispers. Here, I was a number moving through a system built not to see people, but to process bodies. I was led through a series of corridors. The doors closed behind us with the sound of finality. They didn't slam, they sealed, as though each one marked another layer of the world I could never return to. The walls were painted in a shade of off-white that pretended to be clean but could never quite erase the grime of human suffering. I noticed scuff marks along the baseboards, gouges in the doors, the faint scratchings of names and dates where someone had tried to prove they existed. The officer escorting me said nothing. I didn't try to speak. My tongue felt heavy, my throat tight. I kept my eyes forward, afraid to look too long at anything for fear of what I might see, or what might see me. My cell was a box, a cot, a toilet, a sink bolted to the wall, a window too high to reach, covered in mesh that filtered light into something gray and mechanical. No curtains, no mirrors, no silence. There was another woman inside, older than me, with close-cut hair and a scar that ran along her jaw like a misplaced comma. She didn't smile. She barely looked up. I sat on the edge of the cot assigned to me and pretended not to feel her eyes sweeping over me, assessing, weighing. In here, names meant little. It was posture, tone, movement. Those were the languages. I didn't know the grammar yet. The first night, I didn't sleep. My body lay still, but my mind paced like a trapped animal. Every sound startled me. Footsteps in the hallway, the metallic creak of bunks, the muffled sobbing that came and went like a ghost. There was a fluorescent light outside the cell that never turned off, casting everything in a sickly hue that made it impossible to tell if it was night or just another version of day. I clutched the thin blanket to my chest and stared at the ceiling, counting the tiny holes in the tiles like constellations I could no longer name. I thought of my son, of what he must be feeling, if he was afraid, if he was safe. I tried not to imagine him alone in his room, the silence heavier than mine, the guilt thicker than air. I told myself I had done this for him. That belief kept me from unraveling completely. Days blurred. There were schedules, but they felt arbitrary. A bell rang for meals, for counts, for movement. We stood in lines. We shuffled in groups. We learned when to speak and when to disappear. I learned to eat quickly, to keep my head down, to make my presence as unremarkable as possible. I learned who to avoid, who to never turn my back on. I learned that kindness could be currency or a trap, that silence was sometimes safer than truth. The food was gray, or beige, or orange. It came on trays with partitions, each compartment holding something that resembled nourishment but tasted like regret. I ate to survive, not to live. Every interaction required calculation. A glance could be mistaken for defiance, a joke for mockery, a delay for weakness. I became smaller, quieter, more deliberate. I folded myself inward, becoming someone who could pass through the days unnoticed. I watched the others, how they moved, how they negotiated this alternate universe. I saw alliances that resembled friendship but were built on necessity. I saw fights that erupted without warning over nothing or everything. I saw women collapse in on themselves like stars that had burned too long in isolation. There were moments of strange intimacy, braiding each other's hair, sharing notes from children, laughing at a memory of the outside world that no longer made sense. Those moments came rarely, like sunlight through clouded glass, and when they passed, the cold felt deeper. Once a week, we were allowed outside, a caged yard with concrete walls and razor wire that sliced the sky into pieces. I walked in slow circles, trying to remember what it felt like to move without direction. The sun, when it came, was blinding, the wind too sharp. Even the air felt different, as if it had forgotten how to breathe in freedom. I thought often about my former life, but it began to fade like a dream. The classroom, my home, my own name, they belonged to a different timeline. Here, I was a woman among many, wearing the same fabric, following the same paths, carrying invisible weights. We were versions of the same pain, refracted through different mistakes. The hardest part wasn't the loss of freedom, it was the loss of identity. Out there, I had been someone, a mother, a teacher, a woman with a past, a future. In here, I was reduced to function, to movement, to compliance, to endurance. My thoughts became shorter, my speech simpler. I measured time not in days, but in routines. Wake, walk, eat, wait. Sometimes I caught sight of myself in the polished metal above the sink, warped, distorted, a face I recognized but no longer trusted. My eyes looked older, hollower. My mouth, always careful, now rested in a permanent line of exhaustion. There were moments I wanted to scream, to break something, to shatter this illusion that I was still holding together. But I didn't. I couldn't. There was no space for eruption, only slow, silent erosion. They say time passes differently in prison. I didn't believe it until I felt it. Time thickened here. It stretched and curled, looped around itself. A day could last a week could vanish in a breath. I lost track of dates. I stopped counting. I existed in fragments. And yet, somewhere beneath the numbness, a flicker remained, a whisper of self, a stubborn ember that refused to die. I held on to that, not for hope, but for memory, because if I could remember who I had been, flawed, broken, yes, but real, then maybe I wasn't entirely lost. Not yet. I lived in that other universe for months before I understood its language, before I stopped waking in panic, expecting a doorknob, a kitchen light, a voice calling my name, before I accepted that this was not a nightmare. This was my world now. And the woman I used to be, she was a ghost, pacing the walls of a house that no longer existed. It didn't happen all at once. That's the thing no one tells you. There is no single breaking point where everything cracks like glass under pressure. It's quieter than that, slower, like water wearing away stone. You don't notice how far you've fallen until you look up and can no longer see the sky. It had been months. The days bled into one another, same motions, same sounds, same faces. I had grown used to the rhythm of this place, not because it made sense, but because my survival demanded it. There was a comfort in the repetition, a numbness that dulled the edges of my guilt, a sameness that made forgetting easier. But forgetting wasn't the same as healing, and the body knows the difference, even if the mind pretends otherwise. I had learned how to navigate the world within these walls, when to move, when to stop, who to avoid, how to read the air before a fight broke out. I had developed a kind of sixth sense, something that pulsed beneath my skin, warning me when things shifted, when danger changed shape. It was the same instinct that told me something was wrong before I even saw her face. Her name was Tasha. She had arrived only a few weeks earlier, but already she carried herself like someone who had nothing to lose. She was younger than me, sharper, and hungry in a way I couldn't quite define. Her voice had weight. Her eyes scanned a room like they were looking for weakness. She found mine quickly. It started small. A shoulder brushed too hard in the hallway. A tray knocked from my hands during lunch. Words thrown carelessly but aimed like darts. At first, I ignored it. That was what they told you to do. Don't feed the fire. But fires grow, even in silence. She pushed harder. Accusations under her breath, lies whispered to others, rumors that spread like mold through damp walls. She said I thought I was better than the rest, that I walked like I still had a name, a life waiting outside. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. What could I say? That I wasn't better? That I had destroyed my life too? That I had broken laws and lied to police and watched my son's innocence rot in front of me? Guilt makes you a perfect target. It softens your voice. It bends your spine. I shrank beneath the weight of it, thinking that maybe I deserved her hatred. Maybe she saw something I couldn't admit. The tension built like pressure in a pipe. Every look became a threat, every silence a provocation. I started sleeping with my arms wrapped around my chest, my back to the wall. I flinched at footsteps. My world shrank to the space between my bunk and the door. I stopped talking, stopped writing letters, stopped hoping for news from my son. One afternoon, during recreational time, it snapped. We were in the yard, that gray square of concrete surrounded by razor wire and watchful eyes. The sky above was clear but offered no warmth. I was walking the perimeter, slow and deliberate, when I felt it. Her presence behind me, too close, her breath hot with something more than anger. She said something I didn't catch, or maybe I did, and my body just refused to process it. Then her hand was on my shoulder, and everything inside me exploded. I turned fast, faster than I knew I could move. Years of restraint dissolved in a single breath. My fist met her jaw with a crack that echoed across the yard. Gasps, shouts, the screech of alarms. Her body stumbled back, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I shoved, screamed, swung again. I don't remember what I said. I remember the feel of skin against bone, the taste of metal in my mouth, the way my heart pounded so hard I thought it would crack my ribs from the inside. We were pulled apart by guards, arms wrapped around my torso like steel cables, faces blurred into each other. The sky spun. My body trembled with something between rage and grief. She laughed, blood in her teeth, and that sound haunted me for weeks, not because it was cruel, but because it reminded me of who I had become. They sent me to solitary. The room was a box of nothing, no window, no time, just light and cold and silence. They left me there for 72 hours, or maybe more. I lost track. I spoke to the walls until my own voice sounded like a stranger's. I cried without sound. I remembered every mistake I ever made and invented new ones just to feel the sting. In that space, stripped of everything, no other voices, no tasks, no distractions, I met the truth of myself. And I hated her. I hated the woman who thought she could bend the world to protect her child. I hated the lies, the justifications, the fear. I hated how small I had become, how hollow. I thought of Evan, of the last time I held his hand, of the way he looked at me after the sentencing, like I was something broken and familiar all at once. I thought of the nights I read him stories, of the way he used to whisper, "I love you," when he thought I was asleep. I thought of how I had stolen his right to choose truth. I had taken his mistake and made it my sin. When they let me out, I wasn't the same. Something had been carved away. A part of me was left in that room, in the corners where the shadows never moved. I walked differently, spoke less. I didn't care about the rules anymore or the rhythm of survival. I had passed the point of no return. From then on, I existed. Not as a mother, not as a teacher, not even as an inmate. I became a shadow in a uniform, a woman who moved through the system like fog, unnoticed, unneeded, unrecognizable. I had thought the worst thing that could happen to me was being arrested. Then I thought the worst was prison, then solitary. But it wasn't any of those things. The worst thing was realizing I no longer remembered who I had been before all of this began. Not truly. Her voice, her thoughts, her reasons, they had all been replaced by this colder version, a woman shaped by choices she couldn't take back. And no matter how much time passed, I knew I would never fully come back from that. Not because the system wouldn't allow it, but because, somewhere deep down, I didn't believe I deserved to. That was the point of no return. Not a moment, not a choice, but a recognition, a mirror that showed me the truth and left me no way to look away. The first time I felt something like hope again, it was small, ridiculously small. A folded piece of paper slipped into my meal tray, handwritten with crooked letters and misspelled words. A poem from one of the younger women I'd helped with her reading during the hours we were allowed in the common room. It wasn't a good poem. The rhythm stumbled, the lines were short, but it was honest, raw in the way only something born out of desperation could be. And at the bottom, she had written, "Thank you for making me feel like I wasn't stupid." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of my cot, the poem pressed against my chest like it might warm me from the inside. And I cried, not the quiet, careful tears I'd grown used to, not the kind you hide behind your hands, but full, heavy sobs that rolled out from the part of me I thought had dried up completely. Because for the first time in what felt like years, I had done something that mattered, something that wasn't about survival or fear or punishment. I had helped someone, and it cracked something open inside me. After that, I started showing up differently, not all at once and not with confidence, but with a new kind of attention. I began offering to help the other women with their GED prep. I taught them how to write resumes, how to read a lease, how to sound out the words in legal letters they couldn't understand. I didn't do it because I thought it would redeem me. I did it because I had spent so long sinking into myself that I had forgotten what it felt like to reach outward. It wasn't easy. Some refused help. Others mocked the idea of change. But a few came back, quiet at first, suspicious, but hungry to learn. Women who had been told their whole lives that they were worthless, dumb, broken beyond repair. I saw in them versions of myself, shaped by failure, hardened by regret, and teaching them, even in that dim, echoing room with its scratched desks and flickering lights, reminded me of the teacher I used to be, the woman who once believed words could change things. I started writing again. At first, just small notes, reflections, then letters I never sent. To Evan, to myself, to the version of me I had left behind. Pages that poured out memories like blood from a reopened wound. Some nights I couldn't stop writing. The words came like a flood, like a purge. And through them, I started to hear my own voice again, not the version the court had labeled, not the number stitched into my uniform, but mine. One afternoon, the warden stopped me in the hallway. He asked if I'd consider working in the library. It was a narrow room with shelves that leaned sideways and books that hadn't been opened in years. But it was quiet. and it smelled like ink and dust and something that reminded me of my old classroom. I organized the shelves. I cataloged. I made recommendation lists for women who didn't know where to start. I watched as they picked up novels, flipped through pages with hesitant fingers, and slowly began to ask for more. There was one woman who had never read a book before, not one. She was 34. She didn't even know the alphabet when we started. But by the time she left, she could read well enough to write letters to her daughter. I cried the day she read one aloud. Time passed, not faster, but differently. My world became filled with tiny victories. One paragraph read aloud without a stumble. One woman passing her math test. One more hour spent feeling like a person instead of a number. And then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday. A plain envelope with my name, written in a handwriting I would have recognized anywhere. Evan. I stared at it for hours before opening it, afraid of what might be inside, afraid of what wouldn't. But he had written. It wasn't long. He told me he was okay, that he was seeing a counselor, that he was taking his classes seriously. He didn't say he forgave me. He didn't say he loved me. But he said he was trying to understand. And in that word, trying, I found more grace than I thought I deserved. After that, he wrote once a month, then twice. We began a conversation, slow and careful, like building a bridge over water that had swallowed too many things. I never pushed. I answered honestly. I let the silence between letters speak when it needed to. I began to believe that maybe we could build something again, not what we had. That was gone. But something honest, something that didn't pretend pain never happened. I still had time left to serve, months, maybe longer, but the days no longer dragged their heels through my spine. I had purpose again, and with it, the faint outline of a future. Not a fantasy of absolution, but a path, narrow, fragile, but real. One morning, I woke before the lights came on. The cell was quiet. My cellmate breathed in slow rhythm beside me. And I felt something I hadn't in so long I barely recognized it. Peace, not joy, not freedom, but the quiet, steady hum of knowing I had survived the worst version of myself, that I had walked through the fire and come out not clean, but whole in a different way. Burned and scarred, yes, but alive. I still didn't know who I would be when I left. I didn't know if the world would make space for me again, but I had learned to stop begging it to. Instead, I would make space for myself, word by word, step by step, letter by letter. In the stillness of a prison morning, that was enough. That was everything. The day I was released, it rained. Not a storm, not a cleansing downpour, just a steady drizzle that made everything look dim and metallic. The sky hung low like a ceiling that refused to lift. I stepped outside with a plastic bag in one hand and the strange weight of civilian clothes on my body. My shoes felt too light. My shirt smelled like starch. The air tasted like rust and wet concrete. I expected to feel something when the gates closed behind me. Relief, maybe, or joy. A sense of triumph. Instead, I felt disoriented, like a piece of furniture moved out of the room it had known its whole life. I stood still for a long time, unsure what direction to walk in. The prison was behind me, but it was still there, etched into the lining of my skin, humming in my bones. I had dreamed of freedom, imagined it like a golden light, a breathless rush. But now that I stood in it, it felt too wide, too quiet, too unreal. There was no one waiting for me, no welcome sign, no ride home, just the sound of passing cars, none of them slowing down. I took a bus with money the state had given me in a manila envelope marked Release Funds. I sat by the window and watched the world blur past: billboards, gas stations, families crossing intersections, a teenager laughing with her head thrown back. Everything looked new and familiar at once, like returning to a childhood home that had been remodeled without you. My halfway house was small, impersonal, tucked between a pawn shop and a shuttered laundromat. The mattress creaked. The walls were beige. The clock in the hallway ticked too loud. The other women were polite but distant. Some stared too long. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Everyone was counting their own days. I was just another presence, another name on a clipboard. I tried to follow the rules: curfew, job applications, group check-ins. Don't talk about your case. Don't talk about your past. Smile just enough, but not too much. Every morning, I made my bed like I had inside. Every night, I folded my clothes with mechanical precision. The habit of routine clung to me like a second skin. The world had moved on while I had stood still. Finding work was harder than I had imagined. I had a degree, years of teaching experience, letters of recommendation that now meant nothing. I handed in applications and watched faces shift as their eyes scanned the background check section. Some were polite enough to pretend they hadn't seen it. Others didn't bother. I stopped explaining. I stopped hoping. Eventually, I found work at a diner on the edge of town. They needed a dishwasher, no questions asked. The manager didn't smile when he hired me, but he didn't flinch either. That was enough. I scrubbed plates until my hands cracked. I learned to keep my head down, to disappear into the steam and the clatter of cutlery. The kitchen smelled of grease and lemon soap, and something always slightly burned. I saved every tip I got sweeping up after hours. Coins mostly. Crumpled bills with lipstick stains. I kept them in a glass jar under my bed, not because I had a goal, but because saving meant forward motion, meant I was doing something, anything. Reconnecting with Evan was slower, fragile, like handling glass you already dropped once and are now trying to piece together with shaking fingers. Our first conversation was stiff, careful. He asked if I was okay. I said I was fine. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't talk about that night. We talked about weather, college, whether he still played guitar, whether I still drank too much coffee. He visited once, then again. He didn't stay long. He didn't hug me. But he came back. Each visit, I saw less guilt in his eyes and more distance. He was becoming a man I didn't recognize, shaped by years I wasn't part of. His hair was shorter, his voice deeper. He didn't laugh the same. I wanted to ask if he hated me. I wanted to tell him that I didn't expect forgiveness, only the chance to be near him, even if it meant silence. But I said nothing, because I was afraid of what might come back. The hardest part wasn't the judgment. It wasn't the stares from neighbors who remembered me as Ms. Whitmore, the teacher with the neat hair and pressed skirts. It wasn't the job rejection letters or the bank accounts that barely blinked. It was the loneliness, the kind that doesn't come from being alone, but from knowing that even when you're surrounded, you're still unseen, still marked, still outside the circle. Freedom was not what I thought it would be. It didn't feel like flight. It felt like walking across a frozen lake and hearing the ice groan under each step. I had imagined breaking free, but no one tells you what to do with yourself once you've been broken. The world moved quickly. Too many choices, too many decisions. Even standing in the cereal aisle at the grocery store made my chest tighten. So many colors, so many brands. I stared until a woman bumped my shoulder, and I had to pretend I was deciding between two I couldn't afford anyway. Sometimes I missed the structure of prison, the order, the clarity of rules. Here, everything was a gray zone. Everything required interpretation, and the worst part was pretending it didn't scare me. At night, I sat on the back steps of the halfway house and stared at the sky. It looked different than it had through the wire mesh and foggy windows, wider, wilder, but it still didn't feel mine. I lit a cigarette, even though I had quit years ago. I watched the smoke curl into the dark and vanish like it had never been there. Eventually, the jar under my bed filled. I used it to buy a small second-hand laptop. I started tutoring kids online, 1 hour at a time, reading comprehension and essay structure. My voice came back in pieces, through screens, through questions asked by children who didn't know my story. They only knew that I explained things clearly, that I made them believe they could be better. I clung to that. I rented a room in a house shared with two older women who kept to themselves and liked early bedtimes. I planted herbs in chipped ceramic pots on the windowsill: basil, mint, thyme. They died more often than they lived, but I kept trying. I wrote letters I never sent. To Evan, to myself, to the woman I had been. I tried to understand her. I tried to forgive her. Some days I did, some days I didn't. Freedom wasn't a key turning in a lock. It wasn't a finish line. It was a long hallway with flickering lights where each door you opened led to another version of yourself. Some better, some worse, some still learning how to stand. I walked it anyway, because that's what you do when there's no map. You move forward even when forward feels like circles, even when the past follows like a shadow, even when the cage is invisible but still there.